Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from now. This is a story few know, buried in the dusty archives of the Appalachian mountain counties, a narrative history books have chosen to forget. It's the year 1943, in the midst of World War II, when the nation's attention was focused on distant battlefields. But while soldiers fought overseas, something deeply disturbing was happening in the isolated hills of West Virginia, specifically in McDowell County, a region marked by deep valleys, dense forests, and communities so remote that law enforcement took days to arrive. The Crow family had lived in the mountains for generations, dating back to before the Civil War. They were known locally as reclusive people, avoiding contact with nearby towns and maintaining traditions that many considered strange. The Crow homestead sat atop a steep rise, accessible only by a winding trail that wound between ancient pines and moss-covered rocks. The nearest neighbors lived nearly 3 miles away, and even they rarely climbed to the family home. There was something in the air there, a feeling that kept the curious away. The trees seemed to grow twisted, as if something in the ground prevented them from naturally reaching the sky. Birds avoided singing at these heights, and the silence was broken only by the wind whistling through the cracks in the rocks. In October of that year, a young soldier named Thomas Whitmore returned from the war wounded. He had been discharged from the military after an incident in North Africa and returned to his hometown, Tiny Welch, in the heart of McDowell County. Thomas was different. Friends noticed the distant look in his eyes, the way he jumped at sudden noises. But there was something more. He brought with him a story that seemed impossible to believe. During his final weeks in the military hospital, Thomas met another wounded soldier, a man named Daniel Crow, who was dying. Daniel spoke strange things in his feverish delirium, family secrets that should have remained buried in the mountains. He mentioned an abandoned barn, hidden documents, and a cursed inheritance that had haunted the Crow family for over 100 years. Thomas couldn't get those words out of his head. When he returned to Welch, he began asking discreet questions. He spoke with old-timers in the area, those who knew the stories whispered in church basements and dark taverns. What he discovered was disturbing. The Crow family had a dark past dating back to the 1850s, when the original patriarch, Josiah Crow, arrived in the mountains fleeing something in the east. No one knew exactly what, but county records showed that Josiah purchased extensive land with money of unknown origin. He built his house on top of the mountain and rarely came down. His wife mysteriously disappeared 2 years after their arrival, and Josiah raised his children alone, away from prying eyes. Decades passed, and the Crow family continued to live in isolation. Rumors swirled throughout the years, stories the locals shared in hushed tones. Travelers along the trail near Crowlands reported seeing strange lights at night and hearing sounds that didn't seem human. In 1873, a traveling salesman disappeared after mentioning he was trying to trade with the Crow. His body was never found. In 1891, a woman from the town of Eager claimed to have been pursued by a member of the family when she got lost on the trail during a storm. She managed to escape but was traumatized, refusing to talk about what she saw. Local sheriffs conducted some cursory investigations over the years, but the mountains were vast. The laws were weak, and the Crow family consistently denied any involvement. Thomas Whitmore decided to investigate on his own. He felt he owed it to Daniel, who had died alone in a hospital bed tormented by secrets. On a cold November night, Thomas summoned his courage and climbed the trail that led to the Crow property. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, a mistake that would soon prove fatal. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows between the trees. The wind blew hard, carrying the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The higher Thomas climbed, the more the feeling of being watched grew. He stopped several times looking back but never saw anyone, only the oppressive silence of the mountains. When he finally reached the house, Thomas hid behind a group of large stones. The building was old, made of wood blackened by age, with small windows and a porch that looked ready to collapse. There were no lights on, but a thin smoke rose from the chimney. Next to the main house was the barn Daniel had mentioned, a leaning structure with loose boards and a partially collapsed roof. Thomas waited until he was sure there was no movement, then crept down quietly toward the barn. The door was ajar, creaking slightly in the wind. He entered. The inside of the barn smelled of mold and rotting wood. Thomas turned on a small flashlight he'd brought with him, illuminating the space around him. Rusty tools hung on the walls, piles of old hay covered in cobwebs, and crates were stacked haphazardly. The dirt floor was uneven, with depressions in places, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. Thomas walked slowly, examining every corner, searching for the documents Daniel had mentioned. At the back of the barn, partially hidden by a torn tarp, was a wooden staircase leading down to what appeared to be a basement. Thomas hesitated. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to get out of here, return to the city, and forget everything. But curiosity overcame him. He descended the steps carefully, testing each one before putting his full weight down. The stairs groaned beneath his feet, echoing in the confined space. The basement was smaller than he expected, with a low ceiling and damp stone walls. In the right corner sat a rough table made of thick planks, and on it sat a rusty metal box. Thomas approached and opened the box. Inside, he found papers yellowed with age, some nearly crumbling to the touch. They were letters, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be a diary. He began to read by the flickering light of the flashlight. The first pages of the diary were Josiah Crow's, dated 1852. The handwriting was uneven, as if written by someone with shaky hands. Josiah described his escape from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, after an incident he didn't fully detail. He mentioned only that he had done something necessary, something others wouldn't understand. He spoke of the need to protect a family secret, an inheritance passed down from father to son for generations. Thomas turned the pages, increasingly disturbed by what he read. Josiah described strange rituals performed during new moons, animal sacrifices to appease something he called simply the presence. Later diary entries became more incoherent. Josiah wrote of voices he heard at night, shadows that moved on their own, and a thirst that could not be quenched. He mentioned that his father had told him about the origin of the curse, something that began in a village in Europe centuries ago, when a Crow ancestor made a pact that should not have been made. The price of this pact was high, and each generation paid its share. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He picked up another document, a letter written in 1874, apparently by one of Josiah's sons. The letter was addressed to a doctor in Charleston, the capital of West Virginia, asking for help for a condition afflicting the family. The doctor never responded, or if he did, the answer was not in the box. Thomas continued to examine the papers. There were clippings from local newspapers, brief notes about disappearances in the area over the decades. One story from 1887 told of a newlywed couple who disappeared while traveling through the region. Another, from 1933, mentioned a traveling pastor who never reached his destination after passing through the area near Crowlands. The connections were subtle, never direct enough to raise official suspicions, but for someone looking for a pattern, they were impossible to ignore. Thomas realized he was looking at something much bigger than he had imagined. This wasn't just a strange family living in isolation, but a dark legacy that spanned generations. Suddenly, Thomas heard a sound above him. Footsteps. Someone was in the barn. He quickly turned off the flashlight and stood still in the darkness of the basement, holding his breath. The footsteps moved slowly, methodically, as if whoever was up there knew exactly what they were looking for. Thomas heard a man's voice, low and hoarse, speaking to himself or perhaps to someone he couldn't see. The words were indistinct, but the tone was menacing. Thomas's heart was pounding so hard he feared he might be overheard. He grabbed the most important documents he could quickly grab and stuffed them inside his jacket. Footsteps approached the stairs. Thomas saw the dim light of a lamp descending, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. He retreated to the darkest corner of the basement, searching for an alternative exit, but there was none. He was trapped. The figure descending was large, with broad shoulders and heavy movements. When he reached the bottom step, the lamplight partially illuminated his face. He was a middle-aged man with a scraggly beard and sunken eyes that looked as if he hadn't seen proper sleep in weeks. He wore dirty work clothes and carried something in his other hand, something Thomas couldn't make out in the darkness. The man stopped and sniffed the air like an animal tracking prey. Thomas realized with horror that the man knew he was there. There was no escape now. The man slowly turned toward where Thomas was hiding and spoke, his voice echoing in the confined space. He said that visitors were not welcome on Crowland, that there were sufficient warnings to keep people away. He also said that Thomas had made a grave mistake by coming here alone at night, messing with things that were none of his business. Thomas tried to respond, to explain that he was simply looking for information about a friend, but his words came out shaky and weak. The man advanced. Thomas had no choice. He pushed the heavy table toward the man and ran for the stairs. He managed to climb 3 steps before feeling a strong hand grab his ankle. He kicked desperately, hitting something solid, and heard a grunt of pain. The grip loosened for a moment, long enough for Thomas to climb the rest of the stairs and run through the barn. He didn't look back, just ran toward the trail, stumbling over roots and rocks, his lungs burning in the cold night air. Behind him, he heard screams and the sound of more than one person in pursuit. The Crow family had been alerted. Thomas ran down the dark trail with the desperation of someone who knows his life depends on every step. The moon was partially obscured by clouds, making the descent even more treacherous. He slipped several times on the damp earth, scraping his hands on dry branches, but he couldn't stop. The screams behind him seemed to multiply, echoes distorted by the mountains, making it difficult to tell exactly where they were coming from or how many people were chasing him. His mind raced, trying to remember every curve of the trail he had climbed hours earlier. One mistake, one more serious fall, and all would be lost. After what seemed like an eternity, Thomas finally saw the first lights of Welch in the distance. His legs trembled with exhaustion, but he forced himself to keep going. Only when he reached the main street, still bustling even at that time of night with the mine workers coming off their shifts, did he allow himself to stop. He leaned against the wall of a closed shop, panting, and looked back. No one had followed him this far. The Crows didn't risk going down to town. Thomas touched the documents inside his jacket, making sure they were still there. They were crumpled and damp with sweat, but intact. He spent the night in his small rented room, unable to sleep, with every noise in the street, every creak of the building's old wood. His body tensed. In the morning, Thomas sought out the county sheriff, a man named Harold Brennan, who had served for over 20 years. Brennan was known for being skeptical of Crow stories, dismissing them as the superstitions of ignorant people. But when Thomas showed him the documents, the diary, and the newspaper clippings, the sheriff remained silent for long minutes, reading each page with increasing attention. Brennan admitted that rumors about the Crow family had been circulating since he was young. His own father, a former sheriff, had investigated the traveling salesman's disappearance in 1873, but never found sufficient evidence. The mountains were vast and dangerous, and people disappeared for a variety of reasons, from accidents to simply abandoning their old lives. But the documents Thomas brought were different. They suggested a deliberate pattern, a history of secrets kept through generations. Josiah Crow's diary in particular was disturbing not for what it said explicitly, but for what it hinted at between the lines. The sheriff decided to organize an official investigation. This wouldn't be easy. The Crow property was in a remote area, and any operation would require careful planning. Furthermore, Brennan needed authorization from the county judge, and that meant presenting compelling evidence. He spent the next few days poring over old files, searching for any official record that might connect the Crow family to the disappearances mentioned in the newspapers. What he found was frustrating. There were gaps in the records, entire periods where documents appeared to have been removed or simply never filed properly. Meanwhile, Thomas began to feel like he was being watched. When he left his room, he seemed to see shadows around corners, figures that disappeared as soon as he tried to look directly at them. One morning, he woke to find a mark scratched into his bedroom door, a symbol he didn't recognize, but which caused him profound discomfort. He showed it to the sheriff, who frowned and said he'd seen similar symbols on some trees near Crowland during his old patrols. No one knew what they meant, but the locals avoided those trees. Tension in the town was growing. News of the planned investigation began to leak, and opinions were divided. Some residents supported the sheriff's action, saying it was time someone investigated this strange family living in the mountains as if the laws didn't apply to them. Others, however, were afraid. They said that messing with the Crows would bring bad luck, that bad things would happen if the family was disturbed. There were old stories about people who tried to report the Crows and then suffered mysterious accidents. A farmer broke his leg in an inexplicable way. A woman fell seriously ill for no apparent reason. These were coincidences, perhaps, but enough to sow fear. Sheriff Brennan finally secured the judge's permission in mid-December. He organized a group of 6 men, all experienced deputies or courageous town volunteers. Thomas insisted on participating, despite Brennan's protests. He argued that he knew the route and the layout of the property, and that he was the only one who had seen the barn's basement. Reluctantly, the sheriff agreed. The group prepared carefully, carrying flashlights, ropes and weapons only for self-defense in case they encountered resistance. The operation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning when they expected to find the family home. The night before the expedition, Thomas had disturbing dreams. He saw himself walking through the same mountains, but everything was different. The trees were taller and gnarled, the sky was always dark even during the day, and there were constant whispers he couldn't understand. In the dream, he entered the barn again, but this time the cellar was much deeper, descending endlessly into the earth. When he woke, he was covered in a cold sweat, and it took him several minutes to convince himself that he was in his room, safe. The group set out at dawn. Winter had already descended on the West Virginia mountains, and a thin layer of snow covered the ground. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the sound of their breath in the frigid air. As they climbed the trail, Thomas noticed something strange. There were no signs of animal life, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was as if every creature with a survival instinct had abandoned the area. The men exchanged nervous glances, but continued forward. Sheriff Brennan led the group with determination, his jaw clenched and eyes fixed on the path ahead. When they finally came into view of the Crow property, the group stopped to observe. The house looked even more dilapidated in the daylight, with visible holes in the roof and the porch leaning dangerously. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, no sign of movement. The barn was exactly as Thomas remembered it, leaning and decaying. The sheriff gave quiet instructions. 3 men would approach the main house, while the other 3, including Thomas, would go to the barn. They were to maintain visual contact at all times. If anything went wrong, a whistle would signal everyone to regroup immediately. The group split up as planned. Thomas walked with 2 deputies toward the barn, their cautious steps leaving distinct tracks in the light snow. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the structure's old boards shifting in the cold wind. When they reached the half-open door, Thomas smelled the same musty, decaying smell he'd encountered on his first visit. One of the deputies, a burly man named Samuel, pushed the door all the way open, making it creak loudly on its rusted hinges. The pale winter morning light partially illuminated the interior, revealing exactly what Thomas had described: rusted tools, rotting hay, and the torn canvas in the background. They advanced slowly, examining every corner. Samuel found strange marks on the wooden wall, deep scratches that looked like they had been made by something stronger than human fingernails. The other deputy, a younger man named Marcus, pointed to dark stains on the dirt floor. They were old and impossible to identify with certainty, but their distribution suggested something had been dragged repeatedly through the space. Thomas led them to the stairs that led down to the basement. The opening looked even more ominous in the daylight, a black hole that swallowed any light. Samuel turned on his flashlight and began descending first, testing each step carefully. The basement was exactly as Thomas remembered it, except for one disturbing detail. The metal box containing the documents had been moved. Now it sat in the center of the space, open and empty. Someone had removed the remaining contents. Samuel examined the stone walls, searching for anything that might be evidence. It was then that Marcus, who had remained at the top of the stairs keeping watch, called out to them in a low, urgent voice. There was something they needed to see. As they climbed, Marcus pointed to a section of the barn wall they hadn't noticed before. Part of the boards had come loose, revealing a hidden space behind them. Thomas carefully pulled the boards apart. The space behind was narrow, but deep enough to hide objects. Inside were more documents, these more recent than those in the basement. There were also personal items, rings, pocket watches, a Bible with a name engraved on the cover. Marcus recognized the name immediately. It was the traveling pastor who had disappeared in 1903. The discovery sent a collective shiver through the group. Here was tangible evidence, objects that had belonged to people who had disappeared over the decades. Samuel carefully placed everything in a bag he had brought, documenting each item in a small notebook. Outside, they heard the shrill whistle, the emergency signal. The 3 men dropped what they were doing and ran out of the barn toward the main house. What they saw stopped them abruptly. The front door of the house was wide open, and Sheriff Brennan stood on the porch with the other 2 deputies. They had found something inside. When Thomas and the others joined them, Brennan nodded for them to enter. The inside of the house was gloomy even during the day, with windows covered by heavy curtains and dust floating in the still air. There was a strong smell of damp and something else, something sweet and unpleasant that none of them could fully identify. The house was Spartan, with old, worn furniture. On the walls hung family portraits, yellowed daguerreotypes showing generations of crows with serious expressions and eyes that seemed to follow their observers. Brennan led the group to a door at the back of the house that led to another basement, this one much larger than the barn. The descent was steep and the air became progressively colder and damper. When they reached the bottom, their flashlights revealed something none of them expected to find. The space was vast, with walls made of natural mountain stone. There were makeshift shelves containing glass jars of preservatives and contents they preferred not to examine closely, but what really caught the eye was the back wall. It was carved with symbols and words in a language no one recognized. Some of the symbols were similar to the one that had appeared on Thomas's bedroom door. Below the inscriptions was a rough altar made of stacked stones, and on it were objects clearly part of some kind of ritual. There was also a thick book, bound in dark leather, and so old that the pages were brittle. Samuel carefully picked up the book and began to leaf through it. The pages contained more symbols, strange drawings, and text in a mixture of archaic English and another unknown language. Thomas felt a growing sense of nausea as he surveyed the space. Everything confirmed what Josiah's journal suggested. The Crow family wasn't isolated by choice or eccentricity alone. They maintained practices that stretched back centuries, dark traditions passed down from generation to generation. Sheriff Brennan ordered everything carefully photographed and documented. They would need solid evidence to present to state authorities. This was already beyond the jurisdiction of a simple county sheriff. What they were discovering had implications that would require much broader investigation. While the men worked on documenting the basement, Thomas went back up to the main house. He needed fresh air. The stifling underground environment was affecting his breathing. As he walked through the rooms, he noticed details he hadn't noticed the first time. There were burn marks on some of the floorboards, forming circular patterns. In one of the bedrooms, he found an old desk with locked drawers. Using a tool he had brought, he managed to pry open one of them. Inside were correspondence, letters exchanged between Crow family members over the decades. He began reading quickly, searching for any relevant information. One letter in particular caught his eye. It was dated 1917, written by someone signing only as E. Crow. The letter was addressed to a recipient in Baltimore, Maryland, and discussed the difficulties of maintaining family traditions in modern times. The author mentioned that younger generations were questioning the old ways, that there was dissension within the family. The letter ended with an enigmatic sentence about the price of disobedience and the need to keep the lineage pure and committed to the ancestral pact. Thomas gathered all the letters he could find and took them to the sheriff. Meanwhile, Marcus had made another disturbing discovery upstairs. In one of the bedrooms, hidden under loose floorboards, was a set of handwritten records that appeared to be some kind of family ledger. The entries dated from 1860 to recent times. Each entry had a date, a name, and cryptic remarks. The names corresponded to people who had disappeared in the area over the decades. The remarks were coded, but the pattern was clear. This was a deliberate record, meticulously kept through generations. The discovery of the ledger completely transformed the nature of the investigation. Sheriff Brennan immediately understood that this wasn't just evidence of isolated crimes, but of something systematic that spanned generations. He ordered the property to be completely cordoned off and guards to be stationed until a larger team could be assembled. But there was one pressing problem. The Crow family was nowhere to be found. The house was empty, with no signs of recent departure. The beds were unmade, and food was left in the kitchen, as if the occupants had simply disappeared in the midst of their daily activities. The men scoured the entire property for clues as to where the Crows might have gone. They found trails leading away from the main house into the denser parts of the forest, but they all eventually disappeared into the trees and rocks. Samuel suggested that perhaps the family had secret mountain shelters, places known only to them, where they could hide indefinitely. The Appalachian mountains were vast and unexplored in many areas, with deep caves and secluded valleys where someone could live undiscovered for years. As the group prepared to return to town with the collected evidence, Thomas stood alone for a moment near the barn. Something nagged at him, a feeling they were missing something important. He looked around, noting the layout of the buildings, the way the main house and barn were positioned in relation to the surrounding trees. There was a purposefulness there, a pattern he couldn't quite decipher. The oldest trees formed a near circle around the property, and on several of them he could see symbols carved into the bark, weathered but still visible. Back in Welch, News of what had been found on the Crow property spread quickly. The public's reaction was mixed. Some demanded that the family be found and brought to justice immediately. Others locked their doors and windows, fearing that disturbing them would bring retaliation. The mayor called an emergency meeting in the town hall, and for the first time in decades, virtually the entire townspeople attended. Sheriff Brennan carefully presented the evidence, avoiding details that might cause unnecessary panic, but being honest about the gravity of what they had discovered. A local historian, a retired professor named William Hendricks, took the floor. He was one of the few scholars in the region who had extensively researched the history of the mountain pioneer families. Hendricks revealed that he had found references to the Crow in documents dating back to the early 19th century. The family had suddenly appeared in the region with no clear history of origin, which was unusual for the era when most settlers had well-documented lineages. He also mentioned ancient European legends about cursed families, stories that circulated among German and Scottish immigrants who settled in the Appalachians. According to Hendricks, some of these legends spoke of pacts made in times of despair, agreements with forces not to be invoked. Those who made such pacts gained temporary prosperity or protection, but condemned their lineages to a dark fate. Each generation had to fulfill certain obligations to maintain the benefits, and failure to do so resulted in dire consequences. The professor admitted that he had always considered these stories to be superstitious folklore, but the documents found at the Crow estate suggested there might be a kernel of truth, or at least that the family believed deeply in these traditions. In the following days, state authorities arrived in Welch. They brought experienced investigators and equipment suitable for an extensive search. The Crow property was examined in meticulous detail. They discovered more hiding places, more personal belongings of missing people, more documents confirming decades of criminal activity. But the Crow family members themselves remained elusive. Search teams scoured the surrounding mountains, following every trail, exploring known caves, but found no sign of them. Thomas spent this time poring over the documents he had managed to salvage from the barn that first night. Among them was a particularly revealing letter, written in 1898 by one family member to another who had fled the mountains trying to escape the family inheritance. The letter was a stark warning about the consequences of abandoning one's responsibilities. The author described how those who had tried to flee in the past were always found, always brought back, or simply disappeared without a trace. The letter suggested that the pact was not merely with abstract forces, but that it required the family's active participation in specific rituals and actions. A detail in the documents caught Thomas's attention. Several references mentioned specific dates throughout the year when rituals were to be performed. These dates corresponded to ancient European pagan festivals, celebrations that predated Christianity by centuries. The next date mentioned was the winter solstice, just a few days away. Thomas took this information to Sheriff Brennan, who shared it with state investigators. They decided to maintain increased surveillance on the property that night, hoping the family might try to return to perform their rituals. The night of the winter solstice arrived with a blizzard. The wind howled across the mountains with a force the oldest residents couldn't recall ever experiencing. Despite the harsh conditions, a team of 12 men strategically positioned themselves around the Crow property. Thomas insisted on participating again, and this time the sheriff didn't try to dissuade him. They hid among the trees and rocks, covered with heavy tarps to protect against the snow, waiting patiently as the hours slowly passed. Around midnight, when many were beginning to doubt anything would happen, Marcus, who was positioned on the eastern flank of the property, sounded the silent alarm. He had seen movement. Figures were approaching through the woods, coming from a direction none of the search teams had fully explored. They were 4 people, moving slowly but with clear purpose through the deep snow. Even from a distance and beneath the snow, it was possible to see they were carrying something, objects that could not be identified in the darkness and storm. Sheriff Brennan ordered everyone to hold their positions and wait until the figures were closer to the main house. The strategy was to surround them once they were in the open, with no immediate escape into the dense forest. Thomas peered through the heavily falling snow, trying to make out details about the approaching figures. They were 3 men and a woman, all dressed in dark, heavy clothing. They moved with familiarity across the terrain, even under such harsh conditions, as if they knew every rock and tree in the place. The figures stopped near the barn. One of the men, apparently the oldest due to his stooped appearance, began clearing snow from a specific area of the ground with his hands. The others helped him, revealing something buried shallowly there. Thomas couldn't see exactly what it was, but it appeared to be a wooden or stone lid. They removed it with effort, exposing an opening in the ground that none of the previous searches had discovered. It was another entrance, likely leading to a system of tunnels or underground chambers that would explain how they managed to disappear so completely. The sheriff decided it was time to act. He gave the signal, and the 12 men emerged from their positions simultaneously, surrounding the group near the barn. The lanterns were lit, creating a circle of light around the crows. There was a moment of absolute silence, broken only by the howling of the wind. The 4 family members turned slowly, assessing the situation. The older man, whom Thomas vaguely recognized from old photographs as possibly in his 70s, remained calm. His eyes roamed over each of the armed men around him, betraying neither surprise nor fear. Brennan identified himself as the McDowell County Sheriff and ordered everyone to remain where they were. He explained that there were search warrants for the property and that everyone would be taken into custody while the investigation continued. The old man finally spoke. His voice was surprisingly strong for someone his age, cutting through the roar of the storm. He said the sheriff didn't understand what he was doing, that there were things older than the laws of man, obligations that predated any modern authority. Samuel and Marcus approached to handcuff the group. It was then that the woman among them, who appeared to be about 40 years old with long graying hair, began speaking in a language no one recognized. The words were rhythmic, almost like a chant. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. One of the younger men in the Crow group tried to run toward the opening in the ground, but was quickly restrained by 2 deputies. He struggled with surprising strength, shouting something about the need to complete the ritual, about consequences everyone would suffer. The 4 were handcuffed and led through the snow to the waiting vehicles at the base of the trail. The descent was slow and tense. The old man remained silent throughout the journey, but his eyes never left the surrounding mountains as if waiting for something. The woman continued to mutter under her breath, words the guards nearby couldn't fully understand. By the time they finally reached Welch and the prisoners were placed in separate cells at the police station, it was nearly dawn. Thomas remained at the police station as state investigators began their interrogations. The process was frustrating from the start. The Crow family members refused to answer direct questions about the disappearances or the objects found on the property. Instead, they spoke only of ancient traditions, of obligations that transcended modern understanding, of a pact made by their ancestor Josiah that could not be broken without dire consequences. When pressed for specific details, they simply remained silent or repeated enigmatic phrases. The older man, who finally identified himself as Ezekiel Crow, Josiah's great-grandson, was the most communicative, though his answers were equally cryptic. He explained that the family had not chosen their fate, but had been born into it. He said that each generation had tried to find ways to escape the cursed inheritance, but had always failed. According to him, the original pact had been made in a moment of utter desperation, when the family's ancestor in Europe faced utter ruin. What exactly had been promised in return, Ezekiel did not reveal, but he made it clear that the price was high and eternal. The investigators showed Ezekiel the ledger found beneath the tablets, listing the names and dates of the missing. He stared at the document for a long time before speaking. He admitted that the records were real, faithfully kept through the generations. But when asked about the specific fate of these people, he merely shook his head slowly. He said that some secrets were too heavy to share, that knowledge itself was dangerous. The investigators interpreted this as a veiled confession, but legally they needed more than innuendo. As the interrogations continued, Thomas returned to the Crow property with a smaller team. He wanted to examine the opening the family members had exposed the night before. The storm had passed, leaving everything covered in a thick layer of pristine snow. Finding the exact location took some time, but they eventually located the removed stone lid. The opening revealed a crude staircase carved directly into the rock, descending into darkness. Thomas turned on his flashlight and began descending, followed by 2 other men. The tunnel was narrow and damp, with jagged walls dripping with icy water. It stretched for approximately 30 meters before opening into a natural chamber within the mountain. The space was larger than any of the cellars they had encountered previously, with a high ceiling lost in shadows beyond the reach of their flashlights. The walls were covered with the same carved symbols they had seen in the house. But here they were much more elaborate, forming complex patterns that covered virtually every available surface. In the center of the chamber was a structure of stacked stones, clearly constructed with great effort over considerable time. Around this central structure, arranged in concentric circles, were objects, hundreds of them: clothes, shoes, tools, Bibles, jewelry, watches. Each item had clearly belonged to someone, and the careful arrangement suggested they were offerings or memorials. Thomas felt a growing nausea as he grasped the scale of what they were seeing. These weren't just the 2 or 3 dozen missing people documented in newspapers over decades. There were many more, possibly more than 100 people across generations. The magnitude was overwhelming. The discovery of the underground chamber completely transformed the case. Forensic teams were brought in from Charleston and even beyond the borders of West Virginia. Photographers meticulously documented every object, every symbol on the walls, every detail of that long-hidden chamber. The cataloging process took weeks. Each item found was compared with missing persons records, not only from McDowell County, but from throughout the Appalachian region. Many of the objects were too old to be linked to documented cases, suggesting that the practice extended far beyond what any official records could confirm. Thomas spent days helping identify the items. There was a Bible dated 1862, belonging to a missionary who had disappeared while traveling through the region. A pocket watch engraved with initials corresponding to a Kentucky merchant who had disappeared in 1878. Women's clothing from the end of the previous century, shoes of various sizes and eras, wedding rings, lockets with faded photographs. Each object told a silent story of a life cut short, of someone who never reached their destination, of families who never knew the fate of their loved ones. Professor Hendricks was invited to examine the symbols on the chamber's walls. He spent hours analyzing the carvings, making detailed sketches, and comparing them with ancient texts he had brought from his personal collection. Eventually, he identified elements of several ancient European traditions, primarily of Germanic and Celtic origin. The patterns suggested rituals of protection and imprisonment, ways of containing something that should not be released. Hendricks speculated that the Crow perhaps believed they were fulfilling some kind of dark duty, keeping something under control through their rituals and offerings. Meanwhile, the 4 captured Crow family members remained in custody, awaiting trial. Attorneys were appointed to defend them, but the task was nearly impossible given the sheer volume of physical evidence. However, building a legally sound case proved challenging. There were no bodies, no direct witnesses to specific crimes, only objects and documents that strongly suggested criminal activity spanning generations. Prosecutors worked tirelessly to build a case that would hold up in court. During this period, strange events began to occur in Welch. At first, they were minor incidents that could easily be dismissed as coincidences: farm animals dying for no apparent reason, wells suddenly drying up, people reporting intense and recurring nightmares about the mountains. Then more serious things began to happen. One of the deputies who had participated in the Crow capture suffered an unexplained carriage accident, breaking several ribs. Another's wife fell seriously ill with a fever that doctors could not properly diagnose. Thomas himself began to feel a constant presence, as if he were being watched even when he was completely alone. Fear grew among the population. Meetings were held in churches, where pastors tried to calm the faithful by saying they were just superstitions, that there was no connection between the arrests and the recent misfortunes. But doubt persisted. Some older people remembered stories their grandparents had told them about the Crow family, about how dangerous it was to cross that family's path, about how those who confronted them always suffered consequences. These were not just stories of human retaliation, but of something deeper and more inexplicable. Ezekiel Crow, from his cell, watched everything with an expression that mixed resignation and something that could be interpreted as pity. When Sheriff Brennan visited him for another interrogation, the old man finally offered something approaching a complete explanation. He told them that his ancestor Josiah had come to the mountains fleeing not only human justice, but also the consequences of a pact he had made in a moment of terrible weakness. Josiah had lost everything in Pennsylvania, his family destroyed by disease, his lands encumbered by debt, his reputation ruined. In utter desperation, he had resorted to ancient practices he had learned from texts left by his own father. The pact, according to Ezekiel, required regular sacrifices, not necessarily of blood in the literal sense, but of life energy, of human essences that needed to be offered on specific dates to keep something imprisoned deep within the earth. If the rituals were interrupted, if the family failed in their obligations, what was contained would be released. And the consequences, Ezekiel emphasized with eyes that for the first time showed genuine fear, would be far worse than any crime the family could have committed. Brennan listened skeptically, but she couldn't completely ignore the apparent sincerity in the old man's words. The investigators decided to explore deeper into the underground chamber. There were passages extending beyond the main space, tunnels descending even deeper into the mountain. A six-man team, including mining experts familiar with caves, was assembled for the exploration. Thomas wanted to participate but was discouraged due to the danger. The tunnels were unstable, at risk of collapse, and required specialized experience for safe navigation. The team descended armed with ropes, powerful flashlights, and mapping equipment. The first tunnel led to a series of smaller chambers, all decorated with symbols similar to those in the main chamber. In one of them, they found more personal belongings, clearly much older, some possibly dating back to the early 19th century or even earlier. There were also written records carved directly into the rock, names and dates dating back to before Josiah's arrival in the Appalachians. This confirmed that the family tradition was much older than the documents found in the house suggested. As they advanced deeper, the air grew thinner and colder. One of the miners noticed that the surrounding rock formations were unusual, showing signs of strange geological activity. There were deep cracks in the walls, some of which exhaled icy air that seemed to come from even greater depths. In one of the farthest chambers, the team encountered something that brought them to an abrupt halt. It was a door, or what remained of it, made of incredibly ancient wood and reinforced with corroded metal. It had partially collapsed, revealing absolute darkness beyond. The men debated whether to continue. The team leader, an experienced miner named Robert Hayes, argued that they had already descended too far and that the risk of accident was considerable. But curiosity was strong, and the feeling that they were close to discovering something fundamental drove them on. They crossed the ruined door with extreme caution, testing each step on the uneven ground. The space beyond was unlike anything they had seen before. It was not a natural chamber, but clearly carved by human hands over a long period of time. The walls were smooth in places, marked by ancient tools. In the center of that artificial chamber was a structure that defied immediate explanation. It was a kind of circular well, constructed of meticulously fitted stones, descending to depths beyond the reach of flashlights. Around the well, carved into the stone floor, were symbols far more elaborate than any previously found. These formed complex geometric patterns that appeared to have been reinforced and reworked multiple times over the centuries. Robert Hayes carefully approached the edge of the well and dropped a small stone. The sound of the fall echoed for an unsettlingly long time before finally ceasing. One of the men, younger and clearly shaken by what they were discovering, suggested they return immediately. There was something profoundly wrong about the place, a feeling of oppressive weight that seemed to press against the chest, making it difficult to breathe. Hayes agreed, but before they left, he meticulously photographed everything. They carefully marked the route for future exploration, then began the long climb back to the surface. When they finally emerged into the daylight, they all seemed exhausted beyond physical exertion. Something in those depths had affected them in ways none of them could fully articulate. The team's report divided investigators. Some argued that the well was simply an ancient structure, perhaps related to mining or attempts to find water. Others, including Professor Hendricks, believed it was an integral part of the rituals the Crow family had maintained for generations. Hendricks noted that in several ancient European traditions, deep wells were considered portals to other realms, places where the veil between the physical world and spiritual dimensions was thinner. Sacrifices were offered at such places to appease chthonic forces, entities that inhabited the depths of the earth. Upon hearing about the well, Thomas was reminded of a specific passage from Josiah Crow's diary. He returned to the documents he had studied and found the reference. Josiah had written about the need to keep the seal intact, to never allow the well to remain unattended during critical times. He had mentioned that his own father had warned him of the horrors that would emerge if these obligations were neglected. The language was dramatic, possibly delusional, but the consistency with which such references appeared across generations suggested that the family genuinely believed they were fulfilling a crucial role. Meanwhile, the condition of the congressman's wife, who had fallen ill, worsened. Welch's doctors were perplexed. She presented symptoms that didn't correspond to any known illness, fevers that fluctuated without pattern, delirium in which she spoke in languages no one recognized. Her desperate family began spreading rumors that the illness was punishment for disturbing the crows. Other incidents continued to occur with alarming frequency. Spontaneous fires in barns, animals behaving erratically, people reporting disturbing visions at night. Sheriff Brennan faced mounting pressure from multiple directions. On one side, there were those demanding a swift trial and severe punishment for the Crow family, wanting to see justice served for the victims of so many decades. On the other, there were those begging for the family's release, believing that only then would their misfortunes cease. Brennan was a practical man who had always trusted the law and reason, but recent events were testing his conviction. He visited Ezekiel Crow again, this time not as an interrogator, but seeking answers to the unexplained. Ezekiel was visibly weakened. Weeks of confinement had taken their toll, but it was more than that. He seemed to be wasting away in ways that went beyond a simple deprivation of freedom. When Brennan asked directly what was happening in the town, the old man sighed deeply before answering. He explained that by disrupting the rituals, by keeping the family away from sacred dates and places of power, they had destabilized something that had been precariously balanced for generations. The pact required regular fulfillment, and failure to do so had consequences that rippled like ripples in a still lake. Brennan asked what needed to be done. Ezekiel was clear, albeit reluctant. The family needed to return to the property, complete the interrupted rituals, and restore what had been disturbed. Only then would things return to normal. The sheriff pointed out the absurdity of the situation, how he could release confessed criminals based solely on superstition and unfounded fears. Ezekiel calmly replied that he understood the sheriff's position, but that reality did not bend to the conveniences of human law. There were more ancient forces at work, and ignoring them would not make them disappear. That night, Thomas had his worst nightmare yet. He found himself descending the underground tunnel, but this time alone, without a flashlight, guided only by a strange luminescence emanating from the walls. He reached the deep shaft and peered inside. In the depths, something stared back. It wasn't something he could clearly see, but something he could feel, a vast ancient presence that was hungry and furious. He woke screaming, his room covered in cold sweat despite the harsh winter. Looking out the window, he saw he wasn't the only one awake. Lights were on in several houses around town, other people also troubled by dreams or simply unable to sleep. In the morning, an emergency meeting was called involving the sheriff, state investigators, the mayor, and community leaders. The situation was untenable. The town was teetering on the brink of collective panic, and something needed to be done quickly. Professor Hendricks presented a controversial proposal. He suggested allowing Ezekiel Crow, under strict guard, to return to the property to perform some form of closure ritual. It didn't have to be a complete release, but rather a controlled permission to do whatever he deemed necessary to stabilize the situation. The proposal was met with outrage by some, who saw it as a capitulation to superstition and a betrayal of the victims. Others, however, especially those directly affected by the recent incidents, supported anything that might bring relief. The debate lasted for hours, becoming increasingly heated. Then came news that changed everything. The congressman's wife had died during the night. Doctors couldn't determine the exact cause, but everyone who attended to her agreed they had never seen anything like it. Her body was as cold as ice despite the fever, and her final expression was one of absolute terror. The death of the congressman's wife broke the last remaining barrier of skepticism in Welch. Fear turned to urgency. Even those who had previously scoffed at any mention of the supernatural now recognized that something was deeply wrong, whether explainable by normal parameters or not. The mayor, pressured by terrified citizens and the rapidly deteriorating order in the city, took an extraordinary step. He authorized Ezekiel Crow to be returned to the property under armed guard to perform whatever was necessary. The condition was clear. Everything would be supervised, and he would be returned to custody immediately after completing any rituals. Thomas insisted on accompanying the group. He felt that, having set this entire chain of events in motion by trespassing weeks earlier, he had a responsibility to see how it all turned out. Sheriff Brennan reluctantly agreed. The next morning, a group of 8 men, including Ezekiel, handcuffed but treated with surprising deference under the circumstances, set off for the mountains. The old man was weaker than before, needing help walking the steep trail, but his eyes held a fierce determination. He muttered constantly to himself, words no one could fully understand. When they arrived at the compound, Ezekiel requested that his handcuffs be removed. Brennan hesitated but finally agreed. Keeping his guns pointed at the old man as a precaution, Ezekiel massaged his bruised wrists and walked slowly toward the opening that led to the underground tunnels. He requested that only 3 men accompany him to the main chamber, saying that more would upset the necessary balance. Thomas, Brennan, and Samuel were chosen. The others would remain above ground, guarding the exits. The descent through the tunnel was more difficult this time. Ezekiel moved slowly, stopping frequently to catch his breath, but there was urgency in his movements, as if he were racing against invisible time. When they reached the main chamber with the objects arranged in circles, the old man knelt with difficulty before the central stone structure. He began to speak, not in English, but in the same strange language the woman had used on the night of her capture. The words echoed off the stone walls, creating strange and uncomfortable harmonies. Thomas watched, fascinated and terrified at the same time. The lanterns they had brought seemed to waver, their flames flickering despite the lack of wind in the confined space. Ezekiel removed from his clothes a small object he had managed to keep hidden throughout his time in prison, a blackened metal amulet engraved with symbols. He placed it atop the stone structure and continued his chant, now louder, more intense. The air in the chamber seemed to shift, becoming heavier, charged with electricity that made the hairs on the observer's arms stand on end. Then Ezekiel did something unexpected. He produced a small knife, so small it had gone unnoticed in all the magazines. Before anyone could react, he cut his own palm, leaving dripping blood on the central stones. Brennan moved to stop him, but Samuel held him back, whispering that it was too late to stop, that doing so now could be worse. Ezekiel's blood stained the ancient stones, quickly absorbed by the porous surface. The old man continued his chant, now weaker, his voice breaking as his strength left him. The chamber began to shake. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration underfoot, but it grew rapidly. Small stones fell from the ceiling, creating clouds of dust. Thomas thought everything would collapse around them, that this would be their end in those forgotten depths. But the tremor reached a peak and then gradually subsided. Ezekiel's chanting ceased. He fell forward, bracing himself against the stone floor with his hands. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a visible effort. The silence that followed was absolute. The oppressive weight in the air everyone had felt was gone. The atmosphere in the chamber, though still somber and unsettling, had subtly changed. It was as if something that had been too tense finally relaxed, as if an invisible pressure had been released. Ezekiel slowly raised his head and looked at the 3 men. His eyes were empty of any emotion other than profound exhaustion. He said hoarsely that it was done. Balance had been restored, at least temporarily, but he also made it clear that this was only a temporary measure, that eventually someone in the family would need to resume full duties. They helped Ezekiel climb back to the surface. The old man could barely walk now, as if the ritual had drained his last reserves of life. When they emerged into the daylight, the other men waiting were visibly relieved. They reported that during the time the group was below, they had heard strange sounds coming from the depths, distorted echoes that didn't sound human. But now, all was silent again. The mountains seemed to have returned to their normal state, if anything in that place could be considered normal. The journey back to Welch was slow. Ezekiel had to be carried part of the way. When they finally reached the town at dusk, they found a drastically different atmosphere. People were in the streets, chattering animatedly. Apparently, at the exact moment the ritual was completed, all the strange symptoms afflicting the townspeople ceased simultaneously. Those who were sick began to recover. The animals returned to their normal behavior. The nightmares that plagued so many simply stopped. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted from the entire town. Sheriff Brennan faced an impossible dilemma. On the one hand, Ezekiel Crow and his family were clearly responsible for decades of horrific crimes. The objects found in the underground chambers were irrefutable evidence of countless victims. On the other, what had happened in the past few weeks defied rational explanation, and Ezekiel's intervention had clearly produced results that no other action had achieved. How to proceed in a situation where human justice and inexplicable forces intertwined in such complex ways? The following days were filled with intense debate. Legal experts were consulted, experts in unusual cases were called from distant universities. Professor Hendricks spent countless hours documenting everything, creating a detailed record that might one day help others understand what had happened in Welch in the winter of 1943. Thomas, for his part, visited Ezekiel in his cell one last time. He needed answers. He needed to understand what was really happening in those mountains, what the Crow family had really been doing for all those generations. Ezekiel, visibly weakened and knowing he wouldn't live much longer, decided to share the full truth for the first time. He explained that the original pact wasn't made with supernatural entities in the mystical sense, but with something much more ancient and terrible. Deep within the earth, in places humanity had only rarely touched, existed things that predated recorded history. The Crow ancestor had discovered one of these things, imprisoned in an underground chamber by a forgotten civilization. In exchange for prosperity and protection, he had agreed to maintain the imprisonment, to feed the entity with life energy extracted from lonely travelers who would be missed by no one. Thomas listened to Ezekiel's confession with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. The old man continued his narrative in a growing voice, explaining that each generation of the Crow family had tried to find ways to break the pact, to free themselves from the terrible obligation they inherited. Some tried to simply abandon the mountains and never return, but something always pulled them back, or else they suffered fates worse than death. Others tried to destroy the underground chambers, sealing the tunnels permanently. But the earthquakes that followed such attempts were so devastating that they had to undo what they had done to prevent a greater catastrophe. Ezekiel also revealed that not all victims over the decades had been murdered in the conventional sense. Many simply disappeared when they strayed too close to the property during ritual nights, drawn by something emanating from the depths. The Crow family collected the belongings they left behind, keeping meticulous records not out of macabre pride, but as a grim reminder of the price they paid. Each object was a silent memorial to someone who had unwittingly fed what lived deep within the mountain, that ancient presence Ezekiel described as an endless hunger, a vast but incomprehensible consciousness that existed in a dimension partially separated from ordinary reality. Thomas inquired about the deep well the exploration team had found. Ezekiel confirmed that it was the heart of it all, the point where the entity was closest to the surface, where the veil between worlds was thinnest. The well had been built centuries ago by people whose names were lost to time, a civilization that understood things modern humanity had forgotten or chosen to ignore. They had imprisoned something terrible there, using knowledge that transcended science or magic, as those terms were commonly understood. The Crow Pact was essentially to keep that ancient prison functioning, to feed the seal with energy that kept the entity contained. Sheriff Brennan, who had entered the cell during the conversation, asked the question everyone dreaded. What would happen if the Crow family were completely removed, if no one performed the rituals anymore, if the pact were definitively broken? Ezekiel turned his weary gaze to the sheriff and answered with brutal honesty. He didn't know exactly, as such a thing had never happened since the original pact was made, but his father had told him stories passed down through generations of what had happened before, when the entity was free. Entire communities vanished without a trace. The land itself became contaminated, barren and dead. People living nearby went mad, consumed by an insatiable hunger that could not be satisfied by ordinary food. Brennan and Thomas left the cell in silence, both lost in disturbing thoughts. The situation was impossible. How could they allow the Crow family to continue their horrific practices, essentially sanctioning human sacrifice? But how could they risk the consequences of completely stopping what they were doing? It was a dilemma with no satisfactory solution, a choice between evils where there was no option that preserved both morality and safety. The sheriff decided to consult higher authorities, escalating the case to the state government and eventually to federal authorities. While awaiting decisions from higher levels of power, life in Welch attempted to return to normal, but everyone knew that normalcy was a fragile illusion. People avoided talking about the Crow openly, but in whispered conversations in taverns and after church services, the topic dominated. Theories proliferated. Some believed the whole story about ancient entities was the ravings of a deranged family, that the crimes were purely human and deserved human punishment. Others were convinced they had touched on something beyond common understanding, something that proved the world was far stranger and more dangerous than they cared to admit. Thomas spent weeks revisiting every document, every piece of evidence, trying to find some alternative no one had considered. He pored over ancient writings with Professor Hendricks, searching for clues as to how the entity had originally been imprisoned. If a forgotten civilization had managed to contain it without the need for continual sacrifices, perhaps there was a different method, a way to maintain the seal without perpetuating the horrific cycle the Crow family maintained. The nights were long and frustrating, each discovery leading only to more questions without clear answers. In February 1944, federal government representatives finally arrived in Welch. They were serious men in dark suits, listening to every story with impenetrable expressions. They visited the Crow property, descended into the underground tunnels, and meticulously examined the evidence. They spent hours in closed meetings with the sheriff, the mayor, and other local officials. Thomas was not included in these discussions, but he heard rumors about what was being discussed. Apparently, similar cases had occurred elsewhere in the country throughout history, situations where the inexplicable intertwined with the criminal in ways that defied conventional jurisprudence. The final decision, when it came, surprised everyone with its pragmatic and morally ambiguous nature. The 4 captured Crow family members would be formally convicted of crimes proven through physical evidence. They would receive life sentences, but would be held in a special facility rather than a regular prison. The mountain property would be declared a restricted area, permanently closed to the public. Officially, this would be for security reasons due to the instability of the underground tunnels. Unofficially, discreet guards would continuously monitor the site, watching for any sign of unusual activity. As for the future of the rituals, the decision was left deliberately vague. If other Crow family members existed somewhere and wanted to resume their ancestral practices, they would not be actively prevented as long as they used methods that did not involve direct violence against people. The implication was clear, though never explicitly stated. The government recognized that there were things beyond its ability to control or fully understand, and that sometimes the wisdom lay in maintaining careful vigilance rather than outright intervention. It was an uneasy compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it acknowledged the complex reality of the situation. Ezekiel Crow died 3 weeks after the sentence was handed down. His body simply gave out, exhausted by decades of impossible wait. The other 3 family members were transferred to an unidentified facility in another state. Thomas never learned exactly where they were taken. Before leaving, the woman who had been captured with Ezekiel asked to speak with Thomas. She told him there were other Crow descendants scattered across the country, people who had left the mountains generations ago, but still carried the knowledge and duty in their blood. Eventually, one of them would return. The pact was stronger than prisons or laws, and the mountains always called their guardians back. The following months were a gradual adjustment. Life in Welch continued. People worked in the mines, raised their families, celebrated their small joys, and faced their common sorrows. But something had changed permanently. Everyone who lived through that winter of 1943 carried knowledge they could not completely discard. The world was stranger, deeper and more dangerous than schoolbooks and Sunday sermons suggested. On dark nights when the wind howled through the mountains, it was impossible not to wonder about what lay down there, deep within the earth, waiting patiently in its ancient prison. Thomas eventually left Welch, unable to continue living so close to the mountains that now haunted his thoughts. He moved to a larger city, trying to rebuild a life that made sense within normal parameters. But he never forgot. He maintained correspondence with Professor Hendricks, who continued to study the Crow documents and symbols, always searching for more complete answers. Sometimes, late at night, Thomas would wake from dreams of being back in those underground chambers, hearing whispers coming from the deep well, feeling a vast hungry presence watching him from the darkness. The years passed slowly over the Appalachian Mountains, and the Crow family story became something between legend and a shameful secret that the residents of Welch preferred not to discuss openly. Official records were sealed, classified by the federal government. Journalists who tried to investigate the case met closed doors and uniform silence from authorities. Eventually, most gave up, chalking it all up to rural exaggerations or wartime mass hysteria. But those who were there, who saw the evidence with their own eyes, who descended into those dark depths, carried the truth like a heavy burden that could never be fully shared. Thomas Whitmore lived until 1987, dying at age 74 in a modest home in Virginia. In his final years, he wrote an extensive manuscript detailing everything he had experienced that winter of 1943. The document remained in a bank vault by his family, who never quite knew what to do with those pages, filled with seemingly impossible stories. Some parts of the manuscript eventually made their way to researchers of unexplained phenomena, but they were always treated with skepticism by the mainstream academic community. It was easier to dismiss it all as elaborate fiction than to confront the implications of what Thomas described. Professor William Hendricks devoted the rest of his life to studying the symbols and texts the Crow family had left behind. He published numerous articles in specialized journals, always careful not to reveal too many specific details about the location or exact nature of what he found. Hendricks corresponded regularly with other scholars around the world who were researching similar ancient traditions. He discovered that stories like the Crows were not unique. In diverse cultures on different continents, there were accounts of guardian families, lineages that kept vigil over places of power or imprisonment, paying terrible prices to maintain ancient balances. Humanity, it seemed, had always lived on the edge of abysses it preferred not to acknowledge. The mountain property remained closed and guarded, as ordered by authorities. Fences were erected, warning signs posted. Officially, the site was dangerous due to geological instability. Park rangers patrolled the area regularly, keeping out the curious and adventurous, who occasionally attempted to explore the ruins of the Crow home. But there were reports, never officially confirmed, of strange lights seen in the mountains on certain nights of the year. Experienced hikers who knew the area's trails swore they sometimes heard sounds coming from deep within the earth, distant echoes that corresponded to nothing natural. In 1969, 26 years after the main events, something significant happened. A young man appeared in Welch, a man in his 30s with dark, intense eyes. He didn't give his full name, but those who spoke with him noted familiar facial features, an unsettling resemblance to old Crow family photographs that some still kept. The young man asked discreet questions about the mountain estate, about what had happened decades ago. Then, one night, he simply disappeared. Guards patrolling the area reported unusual activity that night, light tremors, strange sounds. By morning, they found signs that someone had entered the underground tunnels. No official investigation was conducted. Local authorities were instructed from above to simply document the incident and continue normal surveillance. The young man was never seen again at Welch, but the guards noticed that certain signs began to appear on the property over the following months. Stones moved in specific patterns, symbols carved into nearby trees, subtle evidence that someone visited the site regularly, performing some kind of maintenance or ritual. The presence was ghostly, almost imperceptible, but consistent. The pact, it seemed, continued to be honored by someone who understood its necessity. Sheriff Harold Brennan retired in 1955 after 40 years serving McDowell County. He never spoke publicly about the Crow case, but in private conversations with people he trusted, he admitted that that winter had fundamentally changed his understanding of the world. Brennan had become a more cautious man, less quick to dismiss the inexplicable as superstition or madness. He corresponded with Thomas until his own death in 1973, and his letters revealed a man carrying heavy knowledge, wisdom that came at the high cost of never again being able to see reality in a simple, reassuring way. The Crow family's victims were never fully identified. The objects found in the underground chambers were catalogued, and some were eventually returned to descendant families when connections could be established. But many remained unclaimed, silent memorials to people whose fates would never be fully known. A small museum in the basement of the Welch Library keeps some of these items on discreet display, identified only as belonging to people who disappeared in the region during the 19th and 20th centuries. Visitors gaze at these objects without fully understanding the dark history behind them. Today, more than 80 years after that fateful winter, the mountains around Welch remain as mysterious and imposing as ever. The Crow family estate still stands, its crumbling structures slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The fences are rusted, the warning signs faded, but the place is still avoided by the locals. There is a tacit understanding, passed down through generations, that certain places should be left alone, that some stories are too real to be treated as mere curiosities. The children of Welch grow up hearing softened versions of the story, tales of the strange family who lived in the mountains, always with the implicit warning that the trails near those lands should not be explored. The full truth about what was imprisoned deep within that mountain has never been revealed to the public. It remains classified in government archives that few are authorized to access. Perhaps it's for the best. There is knowledge that humanity is unprepared to fully confront, realities that function best when kept in the shadows, watched silently by those who understand their dangerous nature. The Crow family paid a terrible price for generations, staining themselves with crimes that can't be justified by any greater necessity. But maybe, just maybe, they also kept something far worse contained. The story of the Crow family's cursed inheritance remains one of the most disturbing and inexplicable cases in American history, a narrative that challenges our comfortable assumptions about the nature of reality. It reminds us that we live in a world far older and stranger than our modern cities and advanced technologies allow us to believe. Deep in the mountains, in the shadows between the known and the impossible, there are secrets that predate our civilization and perhaps survive long beyond it. If you've made it this far on this journey with us through the dark Appalachian mountains and the terrifying secrets of the Crow family, leave a comment telling us what you thought of this story. Did it resonate with you? Did it make you wonder what might be hidden in the world's forgotten places? Subscribe to the channel for more disturbing stories that explore the darkest corners of American history, cases that have been deliberately forgotten or suppressed, and narratives that challenge our assumptions about reality. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any episodes. And if you know someone who enjoys true mysteries and thought-provoking stories, share this video. Until the next investigation into the shadows of history.